when you talked about sex itself, the great promise of the sexual revolution, you say it's becoming a rarer and more elite experience as our social structures revert to something that looks more like nomadic tribal life with no obligation to continue to support discarded concubines. What do you mean by that? She is a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Her name is Inez Stepman, and she's going to fill us in on Tradwifery this morning. She's joining us live. Good morning, Inez. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
We're glad and thankful to have you here, Inez. If you wouldn't mind, for those who might be tuning in for the first time and don't know much about Tradwives, we do talk about them quite frequently, but would you just kind of give us the dictionary definition? What is a Tradwife?
Sure, and it's not necessarily a very new trend. It's been around for a number of years now, but it's just think about any social media online influencer you can think of. Except these women tend to be focused on keeping a home. Often they have kids, sometimes a large number of kids, and they're focused on essentially creating content around hearth and home, right? Being wives, being mothers. Oftentimes they're baking stuff from scratch, and they've come under, I would say, an unusual amount of criticism and hatred in a way that, people who influence on any number of things. Of course, there's an element of fakery to all of social media, but the Tradwives seem to have really set off people. There are all kinds of think pieces about how dangerous they are. There's a sourdough to white supremacy pipeline, right? They tend to inspire, in my view, hatred that is wholly undeserved in comparison to the rest of the social media ecosystem.
You write in your article that the justification that is offered for this rage is that they make the expensive and difficult look easy and natural, setting up impossible expectations. Now, recently I saw a woman on Twitter who was saying that, think she's another fellow at the Claremont Institute, but she was saying that it's probably bad for young women's mental health to see such idealistic women who are and this woman that we're discussing here in just a moment, who has a massive Instagram account. She is the daughter or the heiress of an airplane fortune. She sells soap on her shop for $22. Her sourdough starter kit is like $98 to start. So it can be damaging to young women's self-esteem to see someone living such a lifestyle that they may never attain. Isn't that true, though?
I think that's true, but that's equally true about every other thing that we see online. And my question is why this ideal is receiving so much hatred. I think that some of the ladies on the right who have criticized it, frankly, I think they just come from a very different culture than the average random like viewer on Instagram. And I think maybe in a super Christian, super conservative culture, there is an element of unattainability and damage to seeing some of these women. And perhaps like it's not good for young girls to see anything on Instagram, including, girls in capri and bikinis and on yachts, right? But I do think that the disproportionate pushback again against these tradwives has more to do with the fact that they make the home life or the stay-at-home mother life look glamorous by virtue of being beautiful, by virtue of course, showing the most aesthetic and beautiful parts of their lives. I think that people are worried that they will make this life look as appealing to young women as the Girlboss grind did 10 years ago. Or, I really, so this the one you referenced, Hannah Nealman, she runs this account, Ballerina Farms. Yes, she's extremely wealthy. And what they've parlayed that wealth and her beauty into is this farm with a lot of kids where they can essentially live a homestead lifestyle. Nobody would be complaining if she were using instead her beauty and her, tenacity that she clearly has, and her ballerina training, by the way, from Juilliard, to become, for example, a dancer with the New York Ballet. Nobody would be complaining that she was setting up an unrealistic standard, even though that would be just as unrealistic to most of us, right? So the question is not whether it's realistic or not. All of social media is to some extent fake. The question is, and by the way, people know it's fake, right? Sometimes it's a problem with very young girls, but for the most part, for sure, adults following these kinds of accounts, they know that These women also, they probably hired people to scrub their toilets, right? And the less pleasant and aesthetic parts of keeping a home. They know that, but the question is which ideal is being pursued. And I think a lot of the criticism against the Tradwives is that they have chosen this ideal versus any other thing that they could do and make glamorous online.
Yes, and you speak a lot about fakery in this piece, and as you mentioned it this morning, the Rumble chat has definitely caught on to that. My lovely wife Stephanie, over in the chat, says the housewife life is glamorous. I agree. And Rare Camellia says most of us are like, show me your canning shells in order to prove you're a real trad wife. Okay. I don't know if we'll meet those expectations, but I like what you've written here when you say it's not the fact that Tradwife accounts are presenting an aspirational vision, most influencer accounts do, but exactly what they and their followers consider aspirational that is causing the backlash. What is it that they're really mad about, Inez?
Look, I can give a really direct example. In the 2000s and 2010s, there was a huge rockabilly craze, right? That had a lot of, to some extent, superficially similar aesthetics, right? A lot of throwback 1950s poodle skirts, right? Bouffant hairdos. This is some of the Tradwife accounts really do seem to be LARPing from the 1950s. Not ballerina farms, by the way, but some of these accounts do seem to be LARPing from the 1950s. Those rockabilly accounts and that entire subculture did not come under fire because they explicitly disavowed the values of the 1950s, right? They explicitly upfront said, we just love this vintage look. It's pure aesthetics for us. We in no way endorse, for example, the sex relations within marriage in the 1950s. Some of the Tradwives are not doing that, right? They're actually saying, no, I want to live my life in a much more traditional relationship with my husband. I want to show an idealized 1950s sort of family life, and they're actually endorsing that. And I think that's why people are getting angry, because it's so contrary to what the rest of the culture tells young women that they should want or should idealize. Again, it's not about the idealization, because everything, every like account, every subculture on the internet that you can follow idealizes something, and most of them don't come under this kind of scrutiny or fire. Now, it's true that like there's plenty to criticize about certain of these accounts. Like some of them are just one step from OnlyFans. They're obviously selling like sort of a subservient female package to horny young men. And that's the primary, like these some of these accounts, their husbands never show up, these like fictional husbands, right? It's only the women. And they are, even though they're dressed quote unquote trad, they're dressed provocatively, whether that's like tight or moving their bodies in a certain way as they're, stirring the
Of
pie
course.
crust or whatever it is. There's obviously this kind of sexualized element to it, and it's easy to make fun of. But to my mind, it's not. I mean, there's so much silly content on Instagram and TikTok, right? I mean, it's a target rich environment if you want to make fun of some things. My question is less, are there some ridiculous accounts? Of course there are in this subculture. Then why are, CNN and MSNBC and The Cut freaking out over the fact that a not small number, especially of Gen Z girls, are following some of these Tradwife accounts and appreciating the aesthetic and the lifestyle and that particular ideal. And I think that does go a lot to what values we want as particularly young women to have, and the horror of older generations when they realize that there might be some sub part of Gen Z that maybe doesn't want to follow millennials, my generation, into the girl boss grind, right? Doesn't want to follow into keep spending their 20s and eat, pray, love, and like, getting stressed out in their mid 30s because they haven't found a husband yet, right? Maybe they don't want to make those mistakes. Maybe they're looking at the mistakes of the previous generations, and at least some sub portion of them. I think statistics show that this is not a general Gen Z position. In fact, they're running the opposite direction. But there is a reaction among the minority of younger women saying, you know what, that's not for me. That girl boss vision is not my ideal. It looks something more like ballerina farms. That's the ideal that I'm going to strive for. And I think there's like a terror, like a palpable terror among particularly women in my generation and then older Gen X and boomers that, maybe some young women will not follow what a lot of women, I think, secretly regret sacrificing their lives for.
Oh, for sure. One of my favorite memes, I got married a few years ago and I'm getting ready to have my first child, but I am going to be a bit of an older dad. So I did get to experience a little bit of that dating life during the Tinder years and Bumble, etc. And I like the meme that says, people who just got married must feel like they got the last helicopter out of Vietnam, like the last helicopter out of Saigon, because of how horrible the dating scene has become. And I want to talk to you about this. I can tell that you're the master of saying a lot in only a few sentences, Inez. So I want to read from a few of the sentences here from your article. But let me just very briefly, for those who might just be tuning into the show and wondering what we're talking about and who we are. I'm Austin Petersen. You're listening to the Wake Up America show. And my guest is Inez Stepman. She is a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. And we're discussing her article over at The Spectator that's titled How the Tradwife Killed the Girlboss Age. We're talking a little bit about Tradwives. Influencers online and why there's been such a negative backlash to it. I really like this segment that you were talking about in regards to the sexual revolution and how dating has changed. You say plunging family size means fewer sibling as well. You also say that oh, I lost my spot here. Hold on just one second. Having life in a traditional home really seems impossible. That one of the reasons why we might be idealizing the trad wifery is because, as Elizabeth Warren has, rightfully complained, as you noted that before she got very annoying, that we used to in this country be able to afford to have a traditional lifestyle at home. You didn't used to have two incomes to be able to raise a child. And part of that is because living standards have increased and we have new technology and and our homes are more expensive because we have new types of installations that go into homes that didn't exist in the 1950s. But there has been a severe change to the negative side of the economy that has demanded that women get into the workforce. So there's a bit of a longing for or a nostalgia that almost can't exist because of the new economy. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think both culturally and economically, this lifestyle, one of the more legitimate reasons why people are getting angry at some of these Tradwife accounts is that both economically and culturally, this ideal seems like it's coming from the moon to a lot of people. On the economic side, you mentioned getting a starter home is more difficult. There's all kinds of fancy charts and graphs that show how much more expensive housing is in comparison to incomes. Getting that kind of start in life for a lot of families, including student loan debt and everything else, that economically, that picture doesn't come together for a larger percentage of people. And then on the cultural side, as you read a little bit of, we have to remember that the majority of kids now are not born and spend their first 18 years to their married biological parents, like under the same roof with their married biological parents, right? So the ideal of the family and fewer people because of smaller family size have siblings. So when you look at something like Ballerina Farms, and I think she has 8 or 9 kids. I'm actually not a huge follower of these accounts myself, but um, so I think she has 8 or 9 kids, right? This is not just an ideal that people are afraid will become too rigid or unattainable. It looks like nothing they've ever seen in their lives, right? Most people are coming from, in some way at this point, a broken family background. And so it seems almost cruel. It seems very fake. Like it's very easy for a lot of people to look at that and say, even laying aside the extremely expensive, stove for $50,000 or whatever, and this huge expensive piece of land and et cetera, even laying aside the heiress part of this ideal and this aesthetic, even the basics of it seem impossible for me to attain. And it seems cruel in that way. And I think that is probably a more legitimate, I mean, I don't think it's a good idea to destroy the ideal just because people are having difficulty meeting it. But I understand why some people react to this as basically like dangling something beautiful in front of people that not only they won't achieve because they're not millionaires or billionaires and they don't have a father-in-law who owns an airline company. I think people are kind of comfortable with that sort of unattainability, and they like to see what the rich and famous are doing. But also in that like very simple sense that having a one income household seems out of reach, that having a happily married couple with children that raise them under the same roof all the way through adulthood, that's rarer and rarer. And it seems more and more out of reach and impossible and fake to a lot of people who don't have that nuclear family background. So, I mean, I think that's sad, but I do think that's part of the backlash against this particular ideal, because it really is the particular ideal that these women are presenting, as opposed to literally every other ideal out there. You know, you have the fashion ideal that you're, gorgeous and walking the runway. It's always, beautiful young women, of course. That you are an up and comer. I would say even somebody like Ivanka Trump is like in some ways the quintessential girl boss account, and her social media presence. Right, she's always showing meetings with dignitaries and very chic pantsuits and stuff like that. I think that's the ideal that she's presenting. Nobody has any problem with any of that. It's just when these women use their natural beauty and glamour to glamorize a lifestyle that is more conservative, small c conservative, that is more family oriented, that is that nuclear family ideal, that people suddenly feel that this is like somehow inappropriate and an inappropriate ideal for to glamorize for young girls.
You've summed that up perfectly there, and I think that definitely is the main point. I had one other question for you on this topic. This is sort of the darker underbelly of your piece. I'd like to read this to you and help me explain, or explain to me, if you wouldn't mind, what you mean. When you talked about sex itself, the great promise of the sexual revolution, you say it's becoming a rarer and more elite experience as our social structures revert to something that looks more like nomadic tribal life with no obligation to continue to support discarded concubines. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look at data on dating apps, increasingly what's happening is essentially a type of serial polygamy. And I'm not talking about the polygamy trend that, all of the New York Magazine and the like are writing about. I'm not talking about the polycules, but just serial monogamy, where a small percentage of the men are sleeping with a large percentage of the women. That leaves increasingly the bottom half of men, right, out in the cold, largely. Um, and then for the women who are involved in these relationships, these are men they can get to sleep with them, but not to commit to them long term or to marry them. So it is looking more like a harem structure. It's just like a serial harem, which in some ways is natural for our species. Monogamy is a construct. It's a Western Christian construct, largely a Jewish construct. But it has provided stability in civilizations where there isn't constant warfare, because something has to happen with all of the men who don't get married and can't have families. I would say that our particular way of dealing with these men is we stuff them full of pornography and pot and whatever else. It's kind of a Soma Brave New World sort of ameliorative existence. But if you look at the dating world today, people are having less sex. So whether that's men or women, you see declines in both, in young people having sex. People under 30 who are virgins, the numbers are going up, right? At 30, or who are still virgins at 30, are going up. So your people are having less sex. Maybe that has to do with the digital world or many other factors. And then specifically within the dating world, what you're having is a hypergamous, female liberated sexuality. Basically more or less looks like this. You have a small percentage of guys who are having a wonderful time and have no need to commit. And as I said in that piece, no need to care for, if you have a more traditional harem structure like Genghis Khan, each new woman who's added to the harem is also taken care of and her children are taken care of. We don't have that obligation. So you just get discarded when the new one is on the rise. And so that's not a very stable structure for a non-nomadic civilization. And it's one that causes a lot of heartbreak for a lot of people, both men and women, I think. But
Oh, I agree.
yeah, so
I
it's
agree.
not exactly what the sexual revolution promised us, which was sort of endless pleasure.
And that is definitely a huge can of worms that I'd love to explore with you in subsequent conversations. We are running out towards the end of our time here, and I don't want to monopolize you. You've been so generous with us this morning. Inez Stepman, would you like to share anything else with our listeners before we let you go?
Yeah, you can read my work and the work of my colleagues at IWF.org, Independent Women's Forum. We are a collection of women who have sometimes we disagree. We're kind of all vaguely though on the right, and we are interested in actually looking at policies and cultural ideas that make women's lives better, rather than just sort of pretending to or using it as a shield to either to bash men or to be a front for progressive ideas. So that's the Independent Women's Forum. You should really check it out.
That's great. I've always been a big fan of the Independent Women's Forum. Inez Stepman, thank you very much for your time today. We're grateful for you being so generous. Great piece over at The Spectator. I hope you continue to
Thank you.
put out quality work. And when you do, we'll have to have you back. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you very much.